Bum, 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 ba-dum, ba-dum, bum, 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 ba, 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 ba. Captain Marvel is a weak-ass movie. Every aspect of this movie seems genetically engineered by a team of Marvel scientists to be as average and safe as possible. Now, this is the first time I've ever reviewed a Marvel movie on this channel, so I think I better start off by telling you how I actually feel about them. Well, I think actually that the MCU is one of the greatest achievements in both comic book and movie history. And on average, I love these movies. In fact, I don't think there's a single bad MCU movie out there. I mean, Thor 2 is an average film, but at least it's like watchable, unlike something like Batman v Superman or something. And even Captain Marvel's a fine movie, but it worries me about the future of the MCU. In the beginning, each of the MCU movies felt very distinct in tone. Captain America was the spy, espionage type thriller, Iron Man was the war/action movie, Thor was fantasy, Ant-Man was a heist movie, The Incredible Hulk was, well, just bad, Guardians of the Galaxy was sci-fi, and so on. Each movie felt like its own separate piece of the universe. So when you have Captain America meet up with Iron Man and Thor and Avengers, it's like all these worlds are colliding, and it's really cool. But ever since Guardians of the Galaxy, I feel like the MCU really started to get comfortable with just one specific tone. The most obvious example of this is the constant quips that all these characters have in these movies, but I think the first film that really concerned me in the MCU was Thor 3. And I mean, I love Thor 3. It's easily the best of the trilogy, but it feels so disconnected from the previous two Thor movies. If the other two Thor movies were fantasy, this one's just straight sci-fi. The cliffhanger of Thor 2 set up this great climax of Loki ruling over Asgard, and that was dealt with in the first 10 minutes of the movie. Instead, Thor 3 is basically just a ripoff of Guardians of the Galaxy, and Captain Marvel is the same thing. My fear is that the uniqueness of these Marvel movies is being turned way the heck down. It seems like these movies are all starting to bleed into one tone, which is just jokes and popular music and sci-fi beat-em-ups. And that's exactly what Captain Marvel is. The movie actually starts off kind of cool. We get this great sequence of Veers and the rest of the Kree attack force on a search and rescue mission on an alien planet. And I thought, oh, so this is going to be like a space Call of Duty type movie. That's actually pretty cool. Nope, we're on Earth now. I think one of the big disconnects with this movie is that it should either take place all in space or all on Earth. Instead, it doesn't really commit to either, which makes the movie feel not that special. I love the idea of a space cops movie, but that's kind of what Guardians already is. I also love the idea of a 90s movie with an alien invasion and a young Nick Fury and Agent Coulson, but instead the movie just kind of jumps around a lot. I think my ideal would have been a primarily space-based movie where only one small mission takes place on Earth. But the problem with this movie isn't just the setting. It's just that everything is so mediocre. The villain is a supercomputer that runs an entire society. And on top of that, she's played by Annette Bening. So you have a super interesting concept with a great actress. That means you have every advantage to do something interesting with this part of the movie. And they just don't. Is the leader a supercomputer to make a statement about anything? Absolutely not. And that's basically every part of this movie. It doesn't need to exist. It just kind of does. Let's look at some other examples. Captain Marvel's team turns out to be a group of villains. But does it do anything interesting with that? No. Instead of having a moral debate about fighting your previous friends and partners, they all just kind of turn into Disney villains, so no real tension there. Do they capitalize on using the Skrulls, one of the most interesting groups of Marvel villains? No. They could have made a big name character in the MCU a Skrull, but instead they just kind of take over some no-names, adding little to nothing to the stakes of the movie. Do they really do anything by including S.H.I.E.L.D. into the story? No. Instead they just kind of chucked the Tesseract around a few more places before it ended up back where it did. Didn't add anything by adding the Tesseract to the movie. It still ends up in the same place anyway. This movie is like a McDonald's chicken nugget. It's not natural, it's just man-made. The scene of Captain Marvel standing up at all those points in her past was just emotional enough to be passable. The final fight had just enough things exploding to be passable. The main character was just funny and relatable enough to be passable. Ugh, but worst of all was that pep talk scene with Captain Marvel's friend just before they go off to fight. Oh my god, every single line of dialogue in that speech I've heard before, especially when she called Carol a pain in the ass just to show how funny and relatable that character is. But most importantly, this movie is an amnesia movie. The amnesia story is, in my opinion, the least interesting type of story ever. There are two types of amnesia stories, one where we already know the main character and ones where we don't. So let's say we already know the main character. Then why would I want to watch a story about someone who's not the same character, but someone who just forgot who they were? It's literally the worst thing. It's just for a payoff when they regain their memories. These types of stories are usually flaunted as character studies to try to sound like they're deconstructing a character, when really they're just boring and make me want the story to be over. Except for Grandma Got Run Over by a Reindeer. That's actually a pretty good movie. Then there's the Amnesia story where you don't know who the main character is, aka this one, and this might be even worse because I'm not invested enough in this character to actually care whether or not they get their memories back. It doesn't feel like this was a story that needed to be told. It feels like Marvel knew they wanted a Captain Marvel movie, but not like anyone in particular really wanted to make a Captain Marvel movie. And that's what really worries me about Captain Marvel. Sure, I had a fun time watching the movie, but it scares me that this is the new standard for the MCU. I don't want all these movies to bleed together into the same tone. I mean, the Marvel formula works, but it needs a bit of spice. Captain Marvel lacks any of the originality that any of the other Marvel movies had. Even average movies like Doctor Strange at least have an interesting tone. And it's a shame because my friends hate the MCU, so I wanted this movie to be good so I could prove them wrong. But Captain Marvel is just a weak movie. If you want to have a good time, I definitely recommend you go see it. It's a fine movie. But it's nothing to marvel at.